Hi everyone, Joe from Rose Common Dairy Farm here, talking to you today about our wrap up from our project, looking at different types of soil media for our vertical hydroponic strawberry production system. So this is our field here in roughly middle of June 2020, and just kind of an overview of what we're doing. We have vertical strawberry towers, they're little plastic cloverleaf shaped pots stacked on top of each other with a 1/2 inch electrical EMT conduit going down through the center. And then those towers are lifted up with a 1.5 inch PVC pipe. And then held together across the top, we have an irrigation line and a trellis wire, basically kind of snapping together and holding everything together just so it doesn't blow around and move around too much. But take a little bit closer look. This is what it actually looks like. So each tower or each bucket has 4 plants, then each tower has 20 different plants. Again, this is probably about mid-June or so here. So with these vertical towers, these different buckets, core peat and perlite is the common media that's used for growing strawberries hydroponically. However, when you put them in vertical towers, when you take them and try to grow them outdoors, you come into some challenges. One is trying to get the water to distribute through the towers evenly, so from top to bottom on the tower, as well as getting the water to move laterally throughout the bucket. So oftentimes what we'll see if we're either irrigating so that the top pots are ending up being just right on moisture, and then the bottom pots ending up being dry, so you get kind of a conical shape for moisture in the pots, or you end up with the top pots being too wet and we leach nutrients out in order to get the bottom pots to have the right amount of media. And then, we'd like to find some sort of media that is going to distribute water better throughout the towers, as well as preferably have something that replaces perlite that is a renewable resource. So this is exactly what I'm talking about here. We've got too much water going into the top buckets and not enough water going into the bottom buckets. And so you end up with the top buckets being chlorotic and the bottom buckets, you still end up with some that are just not enough water there. You can see here we've got just small stagnant plants. So what happens is when we're trying to get that water down to the bottom buckets, we end up leaching a lot of nutrients out of the top buckets, and that causes that lack of nutrients causes the pH to be high, over that ideal 5.5 to 5.8 for hydroponic strawberries. And that causes an iron deficiency in the leaves and the chlorosis that I've got marked here. You also end up with a boron deficiency in the fruit and overall really poor quality fruit. And so we have just some challenges, and I've seen this pretty much every year that I've grown strawberries in a peat and perlite mix, and wanted to find something a little bit better than this. So let's take a look at a couple of the different candidates. So core peat and perlite, again, this is the standard. It does well under our dry conditions, can get a little bit too wet under a wet year. Problem with it is when it gets dry, so like in the springtime when you first plant, that peat and that perlite will dry out and then it becomes windblown really, really easily. So the first couple of weeks after planting, you have to be out there during the daytime every couple of hours trying to keep that media wet. Otherwise it's going to blow out and you're going to have to come back in and replant or retop dress with new media. It's fairly easy to mix and handle and plant. However, the blocks of core peat are a giant pain to hydrate and actually get up and get a mix. So there are a lot of labor on that standpoint. So that's the standard. One that we found, or a product that we found, is a core chips and fiber, and the Pro Cocoa is the one brand that we use, though there's others. And this is basically just core fibrous material and unground core husk. So it's little chips about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch in size plus fiber. It's a great replacement for perlite, though it shouldn't be used outside on its own. It's difficult on its own to plant into. It doesn't really hold and distribute water laterally very well. It'll give you a very downward pattern of water movement. So again, I think it's a really good replacement for perlite, and we ended up using that as a perlite replacement. And so what we ended up doing is taking that core chips and fiber and back mixing it with a little bit of core peat in order to give us more fine grained materials and get better distribution laterally throughout that tower. It does fairly well under dry conditions. It's not nearly as much of a headache here to keep hydrated in the spring after we plant, and wind isn't going to toss it and move it around much at all. I mean, you still got to keep it a little bit moist, but not nearly as bad as just core peat and perlite. Fairly easy to mix and handle. So it's 1 block of core peat, which is kind of a pain to mix up, and 3 blocks of core chips and fiber, which is really easy to hydrate and break apart those blocks. So you can break it apart. We mixed it up in a tractor front end loader. I think we've got some pictures on our Rose Common Berry Farm Facebook page showing that process. And the nice thing about this is you can mix all this up during the off season. So we've got a 6x12 barge wagon here, and we mixed all that media up in February and early March last year and just stored it until we were ready to go out and plant. It works great. It really handles, you could run it through an auger or a conveyor, so you could actually handle and move this equipment around with machines. The only thing that we found when we're moving or handling it is that the fine, so that core peat, will separate from the core chips and fiber a little bit, which in our case with the wagon, as we were pulling that wagon in and out, we're backing it in and out of the shed every day while we were, using the shed for other things. We found some of the core peat would kind of settle down through that wagon profile a little bit. So we found a really easy solution after we got the wagon filled up was to just hydrate a couple extra blocks of core peat, throw those on top of the pile, spread it out, and just let those blocks kind of naturally shift down into the core chips and fiber. And that worked out pretty good. The bottom of the wagon, we ended up a little bit extra core peat down there, but that, it was pretty minimal of an issue. Fairly easy to handle and plant into and things like that. We'll show that when it comes to actual labor usage of this product. So works out pretty good. I don't think quite the ratio of mix was perfect, but again, we'll talk about that a little bit later in our results. The other one that we used was a ground core chips and fiber. So I talked about the core chips and fiber before, just unground standard out of the bag and mixing it with perlite. What we found is that we could grind that product up, and we had a product that we liked in 2018 and 2019 that we intended to use in the trial. And it was a really nice fibrous-y material with a little bit of ground up peat in it. And it worked out really phenomenally well in wet years. It did not hold that much water. You could constantly put water and nutrients on it. Even on a rain day or the day after a rain, it'd be fine. It wasn't susceptible to wind blowing, very easy to plant into. And it went off market. Well, lo and behold, I had a wood chipper on hand, and we ended up taking the ground chips and fiber and actually hydrating it and throwing it through a wood chipper. And we were actually able to create that fibrous-y material with a little bit of core peat in it. Because basically that chips that were in there, we just ground that up and created peat, and we ended up with pretty much the exact media that we wanted to. And we really liked this media under wet years. So in 2019 and 2018, when we had it, it worked great. And those were wetter years. And we had pretty good water distribution and water movement throughout the towers on those. 2020 was a very dry year for us, starting from mid-May, really until now. And it's just February of 2021. But yeah, the material works really well. Just run it through the wood chipper. So yeah, we're pretty happy with that material. Very easy to handle. Would not do well running it through an auger or an elevator or something like that. So it's going to be more manual handling in order to deal with it. The fibrous material just doesn't flow very well. It'll tend to kind of stay clumpy on you. So then we liked the ground core chips and fiber, but we knew it wasn't going to do really well under dry conditions. So we ended up going back through and adding a little bit of peat material and then running it through the wood chipper as well. And so the wagon picture that I showed, that was just the peat plus ground chips at a 1 block of peat, 3 blocks of ground chips. Basically, we just took some of that and ran it through the wood chipper, and that worked phenomenally well. It gave us material that was really much heavier than just ground core chips and fiber. It wasn't susceptible to wind blowing, but still can't really likely use it through an auger or conveyor. It's a little bit harder to plant into than just the core chips and fiber as well. And I'll be honest, we didn't really find any benefit of the peat plus ground core chips and fiber versus just using peat plus the unground core chips and fiber. So really, I don't think ultimately there's any room in this one worth trying or looking at any further. But it was an option out there that we, for what using a material that we really liked and just trying to modify it and make it a little bit wetter. But again, no real benefits of doing so. We were hoping to look at taking core peat and mixing it with some corn stover. So I know there's corn stover trials, I think out of Nebraska, that in hydroponic systems, and they could grow stuff in the corn stover, and that was fine, but I think they didn't like it simply because it chewed up a little bit more nitrogen than typical. And we see that in field conditions too when we apply corn stover for mulching and things on vegetable crops. However, corn stover is readily available in Iowa, and it is dirt cheap. And nitrogen in the grand scheme of things isn't that much extra, especially on a cost-wise basis, that I think there's a lot of room to use or to explore a corn stover and core peat mix. However, we were hoping to break it up and run it through with our wood chipper to prepare our media mix for our pots. And yeah, that wasn't the right answer. So we didn't get to try it this year because I didn't have an appropriate tool in order to grind up the corn stover and be able to mix things up. But I think it's worthwhile just by looking at the price. I mean, when you're looking at $3 a bale or $4 a bale for a 60, 70 pound bale, or even less if you're buying it by large round bales. I mean, I could have gotten a couple of large round bales for, I don't remember the exact cost, but it was dirt cheap. I mean, it would have been nothing on my grand scheme of cost wise. So again, worth looking into. We just didn't get to try it. So our season this year, we planted into starting about early to mid-April. We got all our plants in the ground, about a week of warm weather, and then we proceeded to have 4 weeks of non-stop rain. So from mid-April to mid-May, we had rain. And I mean, we had rain all day, every day, in some way, shape, or form. We had constant spitting or rain, just wet, heavy, dewy conditions with a little bit of precipitation mixed in for 4 weeks. We did not run the irrigation system on these towers for 4 whole weeks. And we took a hit on our plant population big time. This is what we saw. We saw some of our plants looking okay, some of the plants not looking good. The bottoms tended to be worse off than the uppers just because a lot of the water just constantly drained down into that bottom buckets and just absolutely flooded them out. And our population it was terrible. And then we got into mid-May and things dried off and we started taking runners. I know you're not supposed to, but the reality is we had so much loss that we needed to find something to fill in the plant holes. And we started filling out with runners. And it's amazing when you're in a hydroponic system and you're hot and you're drying, you're dumping water and nutrients on every day, you can fill in those plant holes with runners very quickly. Within about 4 to 5 weeks after it finally stopped raining, we were back up almost to 100% plant canopy. You could not tell the difference between what was a runner filled hole versus what wasn't a runner filled hole, other than the runners hadn't fully rooted in yet. So that was a good decision on our part. Unfortunately, things got hot and dry, and it stayed 17 weeks with no rain. And actually, I think it was about closer to 24 weeks with essentially no rain. And it just absolutely devastated our for our well. Our well is about 60 feet deep, give or take. And we hit August 20th and ran out of water. And, August 20th was very short couple of days after the inland hurricane where we had 60 to 80 mile an hour winds at our farm for an hour, hour and a half, something like that. So any fruit that we had out there at that point had just been absolutely devastated. Plants looked okay, but fruit was just completely devastated at that point. So it was a very terrible, nasty year. All right, so let's take a look at some of the results because we did get some really good information here. So first off, when we look at planting, oh, look at that. My wife just joined. Awesome. Hi, Marilee. Welcome to the group. So just talking about planting labor. And when we look at our planting labor for the different types of mixes, you'll notice that peat and perlite, it took us 8.5 person hours. So all this is just total person hours for each step. So that's mixing soil, filling pots, and planting. And the peat and perlite, well, because there was so much more peat and the peat is so much harder to mix, we had a lot longer planting time. Marilee, you did most of the mixing for the core peat. Do you want to talk a little bit about the process that you use to mix up the peat and get it hydrated and ready to mix with perlite?
Sure. It was a very inexact process, but basically I would take one of our solid blocks, the condensed blocks, and put a hose on it and hydrate it, basically make sure it was fully covered. So I would push my hand down, make sure that the block was fully submerged by several inches.
So you put the peat blocks in a like a 20-gallon plastic tub.
Yes, sorry, I should have specified that. Yep, so I would put the peat in a tub, hold it down with my hand because they like to float, and that way I could get a good gauge of the water level, and fill it up with water just so it was, I don't know, a few inches probably above the top of the block, and then let it go. I would try to return to the block every half hour, kind of depending on what else I was doing that day, to flip it over just to make sure the water was getting absorbed fully throughout the entire block. If when I flipped it, I felt that it still seemed really dry, or I just hadn't put enough water, I dumped some more water in the tub and just kind of let it go, and basically just keep doing that process until it absorbed all the water and or would just break apart on its own.
And that's kind of the goal, for it to break apart on its own, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because once it breaks apart on its own, then it's definitely fully hydrated and it's really easy to spread out and then mix the perlite in with it or the chips if necessary.
Yeah, so that planting labor time really, it's high because there's so many times that you have to go back and flip and maneuver and handle that peat just to get it hydrated, right?
Exactly. And just the peat takes a long time to soak up the water. And so it's not necessarily, it's the mixing time is what takes the longest. On the chart here, you can see that the planting time itself is next to nothing because of the loose nature of it, but the large mixing time adds to the overall labor time, making it definitely the most labor intensive overall.
Yeah, so, and planting time, I mean, that's 2 hours of planting time for 60 towers. So that's 2 hours a person time to plant 1,200 plants, and not just plant them, but to come back and top dress, clean them up, and just 100% have them all in. So that's moving down the road pretty quick.
Yeah, going through, we were booking it down that row when we were planting those, which was great, but it was does the longer mixing time negate that? I don't know.
Yeah, by far. So your dad did a lot of the work with hydrating the ground chips. Do you want to walk us through what's involved in hydrating the ground chips and fiber blocks?
Sure. The chips and fiber blocks are actually really easy to hydrate. Yes, my dad did a lot of the work, but I helped through a lot of it as well. But so the blocks that we get, most of them anyway, are individually packaged in these plastic bags. And you
Yep,
can
and I
see
showed a
them.
picture of that earlier,
Oh,
the Pro Coco blocks.
perfect. You can't see me. I'm talking with my hands trying to
I
share.
can't actually see you. You're all recorded on the screen. So
Perfect. Um, so basically, so my dad found a great way that he was able to split the bag open on the very top, leaving the plastic around the um, chips themselves intact. So then we would fill those with water, just fill it up to the brim. It would be in a tub just in case there were any holes or any overflow. But fill up the bag with water and basically let it sit until it had soaked in most of the way. You
about
could
15 to 20 minutes.
maybe, I mean, there were sometimes if we had a row of 7 or 8 going down the line, by the time I got to the 8th one being full, I could generally go back to the first one and it was ready to go.
Yeah.
So yeah, just basically we would let it soak up most of the water, not necessarily all of it. And again, if they looked like maybe they had been leaking a little bit or just hadn't gotten quite enough water the first time around, I might shoot a little bit more into it. But basically, once it got to that point, then we could flip the bag over and flip the block over in flip the block over in the bag so that way water drains down through the top that would have had less water in it to start, and then just split the bags open or pull them up. Then again, the goal is to let them kind of break apart on their own. Once they did that, we knew that they were appropriately hydrated.
Yeah. So I mean, you're looking at an hour or multiple hours versus 10 to 15 minutes, really.
Right.
So, and that's reflected there on why mixing prep time for ground chips was so low. A couple minutes to hydrate a block and then run the ground chips and fiber through through the wood chipper took a couple minutes, and then you're good to go with that material. So
right. Honestly, the most time took to run through the wood chipper, just because we had to deal with refilling the bag and going that way.
yeah, because I recall that at one point we had the red wagon filled up with um, chips and fiber plus peat, and we just put the wood chipper in the back of the wagon and just went through and just wood chipped it, and we wood chipped that whole. It was probably about half a wagon in half hour, 45 minutes. So if we had a better setup for doing that process, we could whip through that and pull that mixed time labor down next to an hour and a half on a row, maybe.
Right, because by the time we got to chipping in the wagon itself, we were mostly done. We had been dealing with a full wagon, and so once we got the wagon empty enough that we could get the wood chipper up there, then definitely. But up until that point, it was very time consuming dealing with individual bags and having to figure out where we were going to store the chip mix. And
Yep. But ultimately, I mean, you could drop that ground chips and fiber time quite a bit. So.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so let's take a look at material costs for some of this, because this is what really kind of sets the things apart. The peat blocks are not cheap. The core chips or the chips and fiber blocks are not cheap. So you look at the total material cost, and this is on a per tower basis. So this is 20 plant basis. What is it? Five buckets. You're looking at about $275 for a tower and material cost versus $4.50 for the any of the other media. And I think I talked a little bit about the corn stover. If you were using peat plus corn stover, your material cost would be even less. It'd probably be about $1.50, $1.75, based on my material cost for buying corn stalk bales. So, but yeah, so when you pull all the material cost and labor together, you can see why peat and perlite is so popular. It's your material cost, even if your labor is high, using a $15 per hour labor cost, and you've got a lot more labor time involved in peat and perlite, the material cost is so cheap that you're still under $6 per per tower materials. All the rest are significantly more than that. So you're kind of up even the ground chips and fiber where you don't have a lot of labor, the material just really pushes it up. So. Okay, so I talked a little bit about how many plants we lost back in, well, that wet period from April through middle of May. And Marilee, you went out and counted average dead plants per tower. Do you want to walk through a little bit about what you did out there?
Sure. I mean, so literally it was just that I walked through the field and I looked at every single tower that was in our trial, and I counted how many plants were still alive versus how many were dead. And it was interesting going through, or before I had done that. I know you and I had both talked, and we thought there was going to be a drastic difference between some of the media types. And what I found when I actually aggregated all the data and looked at, on an entire row basis for each one, there wasn't a huge difference between the numbers from the different media types.
I mean, across 1,200 plants, this really is no difference. I
right.
was shocked when this information came through.
Exactly. So, and this is showing the average dead per tower. So basically, I took, all the
60 towers.
60 towers. So how many dead plants did we have divided across the towers total? And this is where the averages came out. And you can see they were all roughly 3 to 3.5.
Yep. And so you looked at, it was either alive or dead. You didn't do no quality, not a alive in good condition, alive in meh, and dead. It was just alive and dead.
Basically, yes.
Yeah, so, and I really wish we had gone through and gotten it alive, good, alive, meh, and dead, but we didn't.
Agreed. But that there's a lot of judgment call in some of that as well.
Yeah, there was. So alive versus dead was probably our most accurate representation of what was actually out there not putting judgment in, like you said. So
exactly. And let's be honest here. It was probably better having me do that activity than you doing that activity, because you would have taken hours and hours and hours where I just went through and zip. Okay, here's how many we have.
Yep. Okay, so we did that in right early in June, and then we did it again in August. And I talked a little bit about setting runners and things to refill the plots before you got in. But do you want to talk a little bit, because you did all the work in June and July reestablishing plant populations. Do you want to talk about what you did to get our plant population back up to essentially 100%?
Sure. So, I mean, it's exactly what you said. We went through, and normally our process is to trim and prune off any runners that start to form on the towers, just so we can get the better plant growth on the individual pot or individual plant versus having runners everywhere and having smaller fruit across the runners. So basically what we did, or what we decided to do once we started seeing that we had plants that had very healthy runners that were coming on very, very strongly, and we had all these dead cells essentially, we decided to stop our normal process and just replant the runners essentially. So we didn't snip them off. And if there was a empty cell, so to speak, so where there had been a dead plant, or some of them, they maybe weren't a dead plant, they were just they were meh. Yeah, they were meh, barely alive, itty bitty plants. I would take the runner, and where it kind of turned, I would pop the root in the ground or pop the runner in underneath the soil, tuck it in, and hope it rooted and took off from there. And
go ahead.
You go.
I was going to say, what you did a lot of the harvesting in too, because you normally would do the harvesting, I'd do the pack out. And my understanding is that you couldn't tell what was a runner or what was a regular plant. once we got into harvest.
Correct. By the time we got to that point, I really wasn't seeing much of a difference between the flower cluster size and the fruit size between the runners that had really taken off and the plants that had been there pre-existing. So I was really shocked by that, I guess.
Yeah, and then that's the nice thing about the hydroponic system. We could dial down the reproductive mix and dial up the vegetative mix and basically just push the plants. And honestly, we weren't even pushing them as hard as we could have. We could have pushed them harder. But being so hot and dry, we we're dumping water on every day. We could really pump the nitrogen nutrient on them and really push them to get caught up. Well, caught up as we were going to get, but get them into at least a reasonable size where they would be productive and give us nice large fruit. And that you can't do that in a soil-borne or soil-based system like you can in the hydroponic system. So that's
Right.
why we were able to do it.
And, one other thing I want to add is, it's not like we were just resetting one runner per plant. When we emptied our towers at the end of the season, we had some towers that a single starter plant had 6 or 7 subsequent runners that were filling other cells. So that's where we see the improvement in the dead plants per tower from the June to the August was just from those.
And honestly, looking at growing the plants in the hydroponic towers again, I'd almost be curious to do it that way, to plant some plants and then fill in the rest with runners, because when they're all connected with runners, you don't necessarily have to have water good distribution from top to bottom, left to right across the pots, because if one is a little bit dry, it's connected somewhere else and it's going to get what it needs.
Well, yeah, we talked about that multiple times, that, another time we'd be really interested to see what would happen if we just planted in the top couple of pots and then used runners on the bottom. And I definitely would be interested in that.
Yeah, plant 25 to 50% of the plants, and then fill them in with runners. So, and I would err towards the lower range and just let them fill in, because like this year there was really no hit to doing that, just partly because the year was so bad for us, but partly because we could mix it and push things so hard and so fast. And if we were in a high tunnel, it wouldn't matter, but we could really move things along. So, okay. Well, anyway, so water usage across the towers, I pretty much ran the irrigation system more or less. Basically everything got the same amount of water each day. The only difference was the core, chips and fiber that we ground up. We split that irrigation cycle over twice a day because they just don't hold a lot of water and it doesn't move laterally real well. But otherwise, all the other media got basically the same, right up until early August, where the peat and perlite and some of the ground chips plus peat, they got a little bit more water just because they had a little bit more plant canopy than some of the other ones, and so we needed some more there. But
and that was also when we started getting really hot and really dry, or we really started to feel the impact of the drought.
Yeah, I mean, at that point there was no moisture, there was no dew in the morning. Our grass had been since dead for weeks. We had dry, windy conditions. I mean, there wasn't a lot of humidity. There wasn't any precipitation, no dew, no nothing. So yeah, you're right. That's really when we were starting to really get impacted. Up until that point, it wasn't so bad. But all right, so we took yield for just a single week, and you can see that we had a lot of peat and perlite yield. Our ground chips and fiber, as you can imagine, being dry, the yield was really not good. When you look at what the seconds were on our peat and perlite, our seconds were pretty much smalls, I believe. And then we had some tarnished plant bug damage out there. So that's pretty much what those seconds were. Seconds under the ground, chips and fiber, that was a lot of nutrient, basically iron and boron deficiency fruit with a little bit of tarnished plant bug in there. Again, because those towers, we just could not keep hydrated under the drought. And honestly, in hindsight, we should have just focused on the top bucket or two and let the other ones die and left them be. But so we had the seconds that came out of there were just unmarketable because we were trying to dump too much water on them just to keep things alive and moving. And then chips and peat, ground chips and peat, we see the seconds there. They'd be the same with the peat and perlite, smalls more or less, and a little tarnished plant bug. So nothing really significantly different there other than the ground chips and fiber. So you recall anything else with the seconds, Marilee?
No, I mean, honestly, and you mentioned, the tarnished plant bug and some of the nutrient issues, but the vast majority of the seconds that I harvested were just small.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the vast majority of what the seconds were.
And normally we try to manage that by going through and clipping off some of our small flowers before they ever set fruit. And we just got behind, mostly because we were so busy trying to deal with the extreme stress that our irrigation system was putting on. I mean, our system was just not built for applying that water all day,
right,
every day. Like our system was built to get a little bit of rain once in a while.
Right.
So, and then just trying to keep up with management when you're stressing the irrigation system and trying to keep tanks clean and keep filters clean and things like that. Just there was never any downtime. So that's what suffered, and that's why I ended up with some smalls. So okay, I guess we should talk about results because we've been yakking for 45 minutes. Okay, so core peat and perlite, it's fairly cheap. It's easy to work with once you get the blocks hydrated. It had decent yield and things like that, though the caveat is I've never had good quality fruit and yield with core peat and perlite, so I'm blaming the drought for that one. This is the first year out of all the years that I've grown in vertical towers I've had good luck with core peat and perlite. We did start to see some issues in August. Notice that the soil on the top couple of pots was getting really tight, and we were starting to see issues with getting water movement down through the towers, and thus we were having to kick on and put some extra irrigation cycles in there, and then that was causing some nutrient issues showing up again from having to overwater a little bit. So there's a little bit of challenges there, and I'm not quite sure why they got so wet or so tight. Again, a couple rainfalls here and there would have gone a long ways to helping with that. But again, if you're going to go into a high tunnel, core peat perlite's probably the one to look at. So anything to add, Marilee?
No, that pretty much covers it.
Okay. Here's just a glorified nice picture of strawberries that came out of peat perlite after we sorted out a few smalls, and plump, juicy, and wonderful tasting. And that's fresh picked, full red ripe, going through all of that. So okay, so we had the core peat plus the core chips. This is what we had pre-mixed in the wagon. We mixed it at a 1-to-3 mixed ratio. And frankly, I don't think that was the best ratio. I think we should have gone with a 1-to-2 or a 1-to-1 mix. Marilee and I, we set up some demonstrations in one of our new high tunnels looking at a 1-to-1 mix, and the growth rate of the strawberries that we transplanted in there, the water distribution that we were getting, and basically just the hands off. I mean, we didn't have to really even watch them. And those pots were outgrowing the core peat and perlite setup that we had side by side. So I think the 1-to-3 mix was a little bit off. The reason we had gone with a 1-to-3 mix was in 2019 when we were doing some of our test work. The core peat that we had bought for some of our test work was a lot smaller, finer grain core peat. That was a very, very small, very fine grain material versus what we bought for 2020 from our different supplier. 2020's material was a little bit larger, rougher grain material, and so we should have adjusted our mix ratio a little bit, but yeah, otherwise it had fairly decent water distribution down through it and across the towers. But again, just we needed a little bit more core peat mixed mixed in there. So, anything to add there, Marilee?
No, like you said, I would be really interested to see what a different ratio would look like. And like you said, it depends on where you get the peat from, what that ratio needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we already talked about the seconds. Again, most of them were small, but that was partially just because we didn't get the small flowers, and then the other things were because of the water. Water was really hard to manage with these.
Yeah, and that might have just been because at this point we had 5 different media mixes and setups that we were managing, and something kind of fell through the cracks. And this is the one that kind of fell through the cracks a little bit. It's just a little bit harder to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
If my whole field would have been this, it would have been quite so bad. But what else did I want to say here? Oh, I totally forgot what I was going to say. Oh well. Oh yeah, you had mentioned it. Water was kind of hard to manage on this one, so I would definitely go with this one again. I would put this one in an indoor environment. You're just going to have to be cognizant of your core peat mesh size more than anything to determine that ratio. So.
Okay, sorry, I did have one other thing.
Yeah.
Part of the issue we had with this one too was when we were top dressing, we didn't top dress appropriately with the right mix. And so that caused some water issues as well.
Yeah, that did. Yep. Because I think we just top dressed with straight peat, and that was a poor choice in life.
Right.
Could have top dressed it with core peat and the core chips mixed, and would have been better. But
right.
I don't think we did that in the actual trial row, though.
I don't remember.
It wasn't. I think we just did that in one of the other rows. The trial row had the actual correct mix because I corrected that halfway through.
That's right.
Top dressing.
Forget I said it.
No, you're fine. All right, let's look at. Okay, the ground core chips. Never do that in a greenhouse. That's for outdoor environment only. It's for normal, whatever normal is in Iowa, normal precipitation or heavy precipitation. So 2019, we had a fair bit of precipitation and we didn't have a lot of problems keeping them wet. We got into a couple dry spells and we just dumped on a little bit extra water there and then foliar fed, and was really a non-issue for us in last year. It will require some foliar feeding. When you get a rain in the ground core chips, just plan on the next day or the next 2 days going through and do a little bit of foliar feeding. Knowing that on a wet year, this is absolutely the material that I want. You just don't know if it's a wet year or how wet it's going to be until after the fact. So ultimately, this one's probably not going to return to use for us just because of that factor. The ground core chips plus core peat, we saw no value of doing this extra step of grinding it versus just changing the mix ratio of the core peat to core chips. So this one will never find its way back on our farm or planting or ever use again because there is no value here. Right? I assume you agree with that.
Absolutely. It was far too labor intensive and costly to justify any gains, and really there weren't any gains when we looked at the results. So
there weren't, and it actually tended to be a little bit too wet. I felt it was too wet, although the results of the number of dead plants didn't show it. This is one that I thought would have had a lot more dead plants than it actually did. But okay, so we should talk a little bit. So end of the season. So one of the things that we really wanted to have was to get rid of perlite in our mix because, I showed that 6x12, 6x10 barge wagon, whatever it is. Well, we have 4 of those at the end of the season that we need to dispose of and compost material, and that material needs to go somewhere. And I don't want to be spreading perlite all over my farm, and that's why we are looking for something else that has non-perlite in it. So again, I really think looking at that core mix with the core chips and fiber is a good option. Coming back and looking at corn stalk bales with an appropriate grinder would also be a good option. We have livestock farms in and around us, but the problem is I wouldn't want to borrow their material due to the risk of contact with manure going into our strawberry crop. So that was kind of a no-go option for us. But with an appropriate grinder, I think would be good. Wood chip grinder,
Not so much.
so stick with the core peat and perlite. Definitely consider the core peat plus core chips at a 1-to-1 ratio or 1-to-2 ratio, depending on what your product input is, and get some rain. And if you're in a high tunnel, maybe consider also installing some overhead wobblers or something to simulate rain once a week or every couple of weeks, just to get a little bit better distribution of water in there, and just kind of fully rehydrate and saturate the media. So any other take homes, Marilee?
I don't think so. I did just kind of remember something that I meant to say like 5 slides ago.
Sure.
When we were talking about the results that we got from the yields.
Mhm.
So I know you mentioned that we only took data for a week, and there was a very specific reason that we only did a week.
Oh, yeah.
And so that reason was we had intended on having results for the entire month, and or close to multiple weeks anyway.
Basically, we were started on August 1st, and
Right.
we were
And
going to
then-
harvest through August, and
Right. And then we got hit by the derecho, which,
so goodbye a week's worth of crop.
right. And then our well quit.
So goodbye the rest of our season.
Right. So that was why we only had a week's worth of data. However, from the
The
days
data
that
is really representative of what was out there.
exactly from because we had already been harvesting for a month at that point, and so none of the results that we saw surprised us.
Yeah.
From before we were keeping track in that very specific manner of capturing for those specific rows.
Yeah, because we kind of could tell as we were doing our harvest early on that that's what it was going to be. We didn't start collecting yield right away just because we wanted to give everything to kind of normalize after resetting all the runners and things like that. And that's why we didn't start. I think it was our first harvest, but July 10th, July, give or take.
We were harvesting before the 4th of July, I believe.
Okay, I don't think we were selling anything at that point, but yeah, I think we started at market at early. Basically, we hit market at Clarion the same week sweet corn hit. So
yes,
it would have been early July, but
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, bunch of thanks that need to go out. One, obviously, to Marilee, my wonderful partner. Two, to Marilee's parents for helping us so much getting up and going with this. 3, to my dad for helping us get up and going so much and all the stuff that he helped us to get going here. And then we really need to thank the SARE Farmer Rancher Grant Program. This project was funded through them. This is why we're able to do so many different types of media and actually collect some really good data. Krista Hartza, Kendra Myra, Olivia Hanlon have all been a big role in helping us get information out. They recorded another video, which I'll drop into the notes. Krista and I did a podcast on the Small Farm Sustainability Program podcast to share out some of these results as well. It's still an hour long. It's the same material. I don't know, who else am I missing, Marilee?
You hit the big ones. I mean, definitely, yeah.
We should thank a lot of the folks that have purchased from us in the last couple of years.
Yes.
As well. We had a lot of loyal following here last year. And so we're really grateful for all the folks that came out and bought product from us as well. So
100%. I know we have customers who travel pretty long distances just to support us, and really can't thank any of them enough, or the people who just went a mile down the road. It all meant so much to us.
Yes. So well, anyway, this wraps up our discussion on the soil media results. Again, we'll link up the other